I'm the last thing between you and lunch, I think. So, there's one more. Okay, good. Then I'm not the last thing between you and lunch. So, I'm going to talk about Bitcoin mining outside of the US. And I want to start with this chart. This is a chart that shows global hash rate. And think of it as the total amount of compute power that the Bitcoin mining industry has deployed. This chart is from 2018 to 2023. And it shows that the hash rate has increased 8-fold over the past 5 years. But that only tells part of the story. Because at the end of the day, you also have this concept called Bitcoin halvings that occur every 4 years. And in the period between 2018 and 2023, there was a halving in 2020, which meant that the actual difficulty to mine Bitcoin doubled at that point because you received half as many Bitcoin, which meant that the difficulty in this period has actually increased 16-fold because we are miners who are mining in a zero-sum game to get a finite number of Bitcoin that are paid to us as a subsidy for every block we receive. Today, that's 900 Bitcoin a day. In April of next year, it goes down to 450 a day. And all this compute power is vying for that finite number of Bitcoin. Unlike oil and gas, where you sit on reserves that you can decide to pump out of the ground or mine, depending on the pricing in the market, here, if you're not mining, you're not getting any Bitcoin, and those Bitcoin go away. Other people are getting them. Another interesting statistic is in 2013, at the beginning of the mining craze, it used to take roughly 13 days, if you would, using a PC computer to win a block. In 2021, roughly in the middle of this chart, it took 10 years with a PC computer to do the same thing. Along the way, technology has advanced, going from PCs to GPUs to now special purpose ASICs that are in their third and fourth generations. This is a business that gets more and more difficult every day as more people enter the business. It gets more and more difficult every 4 years because of halvings. There is not an industry like this in the world where not only are your commodity prices controlled by the market, but your input costs are not in your control other than your energy cost. Everything else is really in control of the market based on how many other people are in this market. This used to be, back in its early days, a hugely profitable business where it would take you 3 days to earn a payback on your investment in the equipment you'd put in. Now, that's somewhere between 18 and 24 months generally for the industry. So how does this apply to the topic? Well, if you go back prior to 2021, 70% of all the hash rate in the world was located in China. Why? The machines were there, cheap power, you had access to coal in the winter, you had hydro in the summer or spring seasons, and so it was easy to mine. Not a lot of regulation, plus this was a great trade for people in China. You invested in Bitcoin mining with local currency, and you received Bitcoin, which effectively allowed you to export your capital without having to do anything regarding export controls. And this was a reason why the government of China decided in 2021 they needed to ban Bitcoin mining. With Bitcoin, there's a unique concept, which is that technically, if somebody controls 51% or greater of the hash rate, they could, in theory, harm the security of the network. And in theory, when China had over 70% roughly of the hash rate, had the government been able to control and nationalize this, they could have had an exploit. But by effectively banning mining, something happened. And that is that all these miners had to shut down in China and move elsewhere. Though today still there's roughly about 20% of mining happening in China, you can see here on the chart the global hash rate dropped 70% almost overnight when this ban was announced. And those miners went to 2 places primarily. They went to Kazakhstan because there was cheap power and you could put your miners in trucks and drive them there. And they went to the United States. Why did they go to the United States? Well, in the United States, you had inexpensive power in states like Texas, where you had deregulated markets, You could bid for power, and they had built huge amounts of renewable energy that was stranded. It was either stranded because the grid connections to these renewable sites didn't provide for them to sell enough energy, but more importantly, so much renewable energy had been built that you had excess energy capacity in the middle of the day when most of this renewable generated energy, which was also the lowest point of energy consumption in the day in Texas. And so this energy was effectively negatively priced. So with good, easy regulation, it was easy to get land, there was plenty of power available, miners flocked to Texas. And today in Texas, arguably over 30% of mining capacity in the US is done in Texas. Great low prices, great environment. There's so much mining capacity in Texas today that when the grid needs energy, instead of using peaker plants, which are gas-fired plants that typically kick on to balance the load in the grid, Bitcoin miners can shut off up to 2 gigawatts of power and give it back to the grid. Which means that during winter storms, when heating is needed, or during summer heat waves, when air conditioning is needed, Bitcoin miners can respond in 10 minutes, much faster than a gas-fired power plant can kick on a peaker plant, load up, and go. And if you look at energy markets, this has a huge impact on pricing because it normalizes pricing. The other impact it has is that the battery vendors who are trying to sell battery technology to large grid utilities, which can cost a grid operator up to $2 million a megawatt, all of a sudden you have Bitcoin miners who are willing to take on all of the CapEx, who can shed load at an instant and effectively provide the same service as battery vendors. So interestingly enough, in Texas, you have this perfect example of how Bitcoin mining has become an integral part of grid stability. And this story is now starting to move from Texas to other places in the world. So in the early days, miners looked for low-cost energy and primarily operated in cool climates because miners typically used air to cool them. Now miners are seeking not just low-cost and abundant energy, but primarily renewable energy. Mining went from being 70% based on coal and fossil fuel to now being almost 60% on a global basis based on renewable or sustainable fuel sources. They also seek friendly regulatory environments and typically economic incentives. So where else can mining go to expand and support energy infrastructure? Because nowadays there are new technologies like immersion, which allow you to put miners essentially in a liquid and keep them cool, regardless of the temperature in the environment. And I'll talk a little bit more about this regarding our facility here in UAE in partnership that we have with Zero2. But mining is expanding globally because the energy grids need it too. So for example, in UAE, we just inaugurated together with our partner Zero2 a facility last week in Abu Dhabi, which is 200 megawatts, together with a prior facility that was opened in July, that's 50 megawatts. Total of 250 megawatts of Bitcoin mining capacity that effectively can act as a load balancer, and has acted as a load balancer for the grid this past summer. These miners are all in immersion systems, which keep them cool even in 55 degrees C ambient temperature and 95% humidity. Very hostile environment for technology products. But it was the perfect proof point to show that you can take Bitcoin mining, use it to stabilize a grid where you have this asymmetry in demand, which allows that grid to operate in a more balanced fashion. Because energy demand is not constant during the day, it varies. And it's very hard to call a gas plant and say, hey, I need an extra so many megawatts of power. It takes time. You can call a Bitcoin miner and say, hey, I need an extra so many megawatts of power. They just shut off. And then an hour or two later, when the demand is gone, they can fire up again. It's a great way to maximize profitability of energy grids, provide more stability to energy grids, and more importantly, provide a great return on investment for deploying renewable, intermittent energy like solar and wind. So in the UAE, because of the temperature differences between winter and summer, you have to have capacity to cover maximum demand. Nobody wants there to be a blackout. But that's wasted capacity in the months when it's not needed, and that's another place Bitcoin fills. Paraguay, South America. Why Paraguay? Huge amounts of hydroelectricity. They built a hydroelectric dam together with Brazil, one of the largest in the world, that now has been paid for. Paraguay has very low energy consumption on a per capita basis, yet they have access to all this energy, and they have to sell that energy at a loss to Brazil because they don't have demand for it. And so the power utility is essentially losing money on a consistent basis. By now opening up that excess capacity to Bitcoin miners, they're at least able to break even. And more importantly, they get grid stability. So this is very important for the long-term energy infrastructure play. What about Africa? In Africa, you have very similar problems, though different. You have built microgrids that in and of themselves can be very unstable. And by adding Bitcoin mining to microgrids, you can stabilize those grids, especially as you bring more and more renewable energy that's intermittent. This provides greater and greater grid stability. More importantly, Bitcoin mining can offer other advantages other than just supporting energy infrastructure. Bitcoin mining can mitigate methane. Methane flare, whether it's oil field, whether it's landfill gas, whether it is biomass, is a climate problem. And if you can mitigate that methane, convert it to carbon dioxide by burning it and generating electricity, you are essentially mitigating something 80 times more damaging to the environment over a 20-year period than carbon dioxide. It has a huge impact positively on the environment. You can do landfills, you can do sewage, you can do all sorts of things with this. You can repurpose that heat. Electronics generate heat. You put 1,000 watts of energy into a Bitcoin miner, you're going to get 950 to 975 watts of heat out of it. 60% of consumers' use of energy in cooler climates is for heating the home and cooking, heating water, bathing. If you had Bitcoin miners in every home, I know it sounds like a dream, you could not only subsidize your electricity, but you'd have free hot water, and you'd have free heating in the home. But now what about the industrial uses of that energy? We have a pilot going in the state of Washington where we are heating water to do shrimp farming on an agricultural scale. You can take Bitcoin mining, go into a developing country, use it to stabilize the grid, more importantly, use it to generate electricity because you're using biomass or some other fuel source, and then use the heat offtake to create protein products, heat hothouses. You can even use it for water desalination. Bitcoin mining becomes really just a utility between power generation and creating food and other products that can benefit communities throughout the developing world and even in the developed world. And so we believe at Marathon that part of our role is really changing Bitcoin mining from just being this thing that generates Bitcoin to being a positive factor in helping countries develop their economies, providing better services to people, and creating more stable energy infrastructure. Thank you very much.